my story coming into this circle with pro-choice actually came from a long line of just injustice towards women in general, because like my cohort Melissa, I grew up evangelical, but I was an evangelical into adulthood. And for my mother, I mean, with me growing up in an abusive situation and my dad being very abusive to all of us, that was my mother's way of having a support network and managing to get through every day. So growing up that way, when I ended up, you know, I had my older son, actually quite young. My older son is not here. He's almost 17. You know, and then moving on out of high school and into college, I ended up marrying someone who was a lot like my dad. And going through the domestic violence courts and almost losing my kids to foster care and ending up in like severe poverty with them, you know, I joined an evangelical church because I wasn't really going when I first started college. But, you know, it is a place where you feel like you have community. Here's my younger son right here who's actually enjoying this very much. If you didn't hear him like clapping, and a couple times he said, "You go girl," you know. Yeah. So I was getting very ingrained into this as well, you know, where I should have noticed right away that this was actually a culture that was actually perpetuating some of the things that were happening to me. In the evangelical culture, you know, women are supposed to remain silent, men are head of the household. Poverty is something that, you know, they never really addressed. But, you know, being anti-choice was something very easy for most evangelicals. I mean, it's like lazy righteousness. It's something that you can get very angry at, and it's no sacrifice on your part. There's no, like, actually dealing with anyone poor, dealing with systemic issues, actually opening up your own wallet to deal with it. You can be righteous, and it costs you nothing. So this was a huge cause within these circles. But as I was, you know, in the church, and at the same time going through this court case, it took 3.5 years. I saw these little seeds that were being planted along the way. The abuse I grew up with, swearing I would never repeat this behavior because, well, I didn't want it to happen, and thinking that I was just going to tell myself this was enough. That was enough, you know. But no, I mean, you repeat these choices because it's familiar. And then marrying someone who did the same thing to me, you know, I fell into a situation that was like just off. I can't even really begin to explain what it feels like to be afraid every day and almost have someone take your children from you because you really have no idea how you're going to get out. I mean, originally CPS didn't really give me many options. It wasn't until we were still getting beaten while being investigated that they put us in intensive neglect services instead of taking my kids away. So I actually got very lucky there. And then the seeds being planted there, you know, where they told me that they were going to put me on the neglect registry because I couldn't stop my ex from beating me in front of the kids. And because I wasn't protecting the children themselves, that I was actually neglectful. Like, this was also my responsibility. This was my fault. So little seeds you see in there getting planted, that there's something wrong systemically. Before even all of this stuff happening now, I knew that things were not equal yet. We weren't there yet. We were making progress as women, but we weren't quite there yet. I mean, when you actually still blame victims of domestic violence for not being protective enough, you are not quite there yet. But then going into the welfare office, once I finally was able to escape and break free from it, and we were still being investigated at that point, but going in there and telling them I wanted to go back to school. You know, I had failed out of school when I was getting beaten. So I wanted to go back. And MSU accepted me. They found getting beaten a pretty good reason to fail, so they let me come back in. But the welfare office thought that I was using it as an excuse not to work. And I had to ask them, like, well, why would you consider school not work? Like, if I don't actually do work in classes, when I fail, they kick me out. They're like, well, we don't want you to be a lifelong student. Well, you can't. I mean, you get 12 semesters of financial aid, and after that, you don't pay me enough to pay my tuition. So, I mean, really, you could give me just 2 more years, and I'll be out of your system, or you could just force me to continue to work part-time with no benefits and see me here forever. And nope, it didn't matter, because they automatically assumed as a poor mom I was like trying to trick them out of something. I'm obviously too dumb to go to school, but smart enough to trick them. But so, I mean, like, just little seeds planted. I mean, through all of these instances, like going through absolute hell, when it's one thing to recognize you know, something's wrong when you're comfortable. And I actually have a lot of respect for people who recognize an injustice when they don't have to live through it and can still stand up for it. In my case, I actually had to go through it all and actually live through an absolute hell before I realized things were very wrong. And the church that I was a part of did not address any of it, but it was kind of a slow process. I still hung on to a lot of those evangelical ideals. I remember even getting divorced when they were trying to tell us, well, being that if I had never married, they would have told me that I should marry a Christian man who would be head of the household. But because I was divorced, I remember the church telling me that it would be a sin for me to remarry, and I would be an adulterer because I do not have a valid church reason to actually be divorced. So I mean, so there's all of these bizarre things within the church that little seeds planted. There's something wrong. There's something wrong here. I started to break away. I started to wake up little bit by little bit. I started college again, and the only reason why I did is my landlord owned my best friend's house, or the house I was living in. So, actually I gotta back that up, I messed that up. It was my best friend's dad who owned the house, and she was living in it. So yes, my new landlord from when I moved out on my own was my best friend's landlord too, but it was her dad. And he said that I could forgo rent so I could pay daycare to go back to school that first semester if I promised him my tax refund in January. So that's the only reason why I got back into school. It was almost luck. It was just sheer luck. Went back to school and then actually started to learn about these things I was seeing were a real phenomenon. I wasn't just imagining it. These were real problems that I was dealing with, and people everywhere were dealing with them. And that's when I really started to get these ideas formed and started to break away from the church and realizing that these very simple like ideas that they were outraged about, like choice, were the wrong places for them to put their anger. They weren't putting their anger in these systemic poverty issues I was living in, through, and they knew about it. They didn't have their anger about the man that was beating me. They told me that since the Bible didn't address it, I was never allowed to be remarried. If he was cheating on me, then I would actually have the right reason to divorce. And so I had doomed myself as a very young woman in her 20s to be single the rest of my life. Like, I realized this misplaced righteousness was just laziness. It is lazy righteousness. They don't deal with this like systemic problem. So I eventually broke away, but it also is my way of reforming ideas, because I was in the domestic court cases, and there was a woman there who had said to the rest of the group that she had miscarried because her husband at the time that she was in the process of divorcing broke one of their two sons' arms in a rage. And so she had said to everyone there that she had a miscarriage, and it wasn't until months later when she and I became closer, and she would sometimes watch my kids if I had to go to a group, and I'd watch her kids if she had to go to one of these court-ordered groups, that she had confided in me that she actually had an abortion because she was afraid of one more tie to the man that was beating her children and her. But the fact that she was so ashamed that she would choose to abort a baby, so that she would even lie to the courts and lie because she was afraid of like any kind of social reprimand is terrible. I mean, this woman was getting beaten and her children were getting beaten, and one of her children was actually hospitalized from it, and she was afraid that people would find out that she was trying to do whatever she could to cut more ties from this man. And I mean, just going through these situations, like, the easy answer is babies. We're here to save babies, but they don't know the real stories behind it. They don't know what actually people are going through when some of these choices are made. They don't acknowledge some of the fear that some of these women go through. I mean, the real coercion would have been her having this baby, but now these laws are talking about how women might be coerced into getting abortions, when usually an abusive man would love for you to have a baby as one more tie to force them there with you. So my story, I mean, even coming into this choice arena, actually came from, and it stemmed from many, many other injustices that women face. And actually, men and women face. Just unfortunately, women, especially women with children, tend to face more frequently. So, I don't know, I guess that's it. And yes, pro-choice women love their children.